The wind swept across the battlements of the Red Keep, carrying the scent of smoke and iron. Jon Snow stood at the edge, his dark cloak flapping around him, eyes fixed on the city below. King's Landing had been quiet for days, but the quiet felt uneasy, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Jon had taken the throne not through bloodlust or betrayal, but because it was his duty, and he intended to rule differently. The people whispered about the young king who had walked out of the north with nothing but honor and a sword. Some feared him, thinking he was a boy who knew nothing of politics, but Jon had learned quickly that ruling was a battle of a different kind. Every choice could burn lives, and every mercy could either save or doom someone. He remembered the journey that had brought him here, the long march south, the alliances forged with wary lords, the dragons that had roared into the skies not as weapons of fear, but as symbols of hope. Drogon, once a creature of destruction, now soared beside Jon as a reminder that even fire could protect, not just destroy. Jon's counsel had been uneasy at first. Sansa, sharp and calculating, questioned every move he made. Tyrion, ever the clever advisor, warned him that honor alone could not hold a kingdom together. Yet Jon listened. He weighed every voice, every plea, not with pride or desire for power, but with a sense of fairness that was alien in the halls of Westeros. The first decree he issued sent shockwaves through the city. He declared that all houses that had served the realm honorably, even those who had once been enemies, would be granted pardons if they swore loyalty to the crown. It was a gamble. Some whispered that he was naive, but Jon believed that the wheel of vengeance could be broken, that fear and suspicion could be replaced with justice and trust. In the streets below, children ran freely, their laughter echoing against the stone walls, while merchants began to rebuild shops that had long been abandoned. Soldiers returned to their homes, no longer forced into endless skirmishes for the ambitions of lords. And yet, even as hope stirred, shadows lingered. In the whispers of the dark alleys, in the silent glances of the noble houses, plots were forming. Some called it the inevitable reaction of a city used to fear, while Jon knew it was the cost of doing what was right. He had not forgotten the Night King, the horrors beyond the wall, nor the battles that had shaped him. Every decision he made now carried the weight of those losses, the faces of friends and family lost in wars that should never have been fought. He had learned the hardest lesson of all, that power without mercy is tyranny, but mercy without vigilance can be deadly. As the sun dipped behind the Red Keep, Jon turned from the battlements and walked into the council chamber. Maps were spread across the table, letters from distant lords piled high. He would need to act carefully. Alliances must be rebuilt, old wounds healed, and a kingdom united, not through fear or blood, but through a fire that burned within him, the fire of honor. For Jon Snow, ruling Westeros was not about glory or conquest. It was about creating a world where loyalty was rewarded, justice mattered, and even in the face of betrayal, honor could guide the crown. The path ahead was dangerous, filled with treachery, envy, and the ghosts of the past. Yet, as he looked into the flames dancing in the hearth, he felt something rare in this land of shadows: hope. Jon Snow had barely settled into the rhythms of ruling when the first real challenge arose. Word came from the Riverlands that House Frey, remnants of the treacherous family that had orchestrated the Red Wedding, had begun to stir unrest. Some of their bannermen refused to acknowledge the new order, emboldened by whispers that the Northman king was too soft, too honorable to punish disloyalty. Jon knew that bending to fear would only invite chaos. He summoned a council at once, calling Sansa, Tyrion, Brienne, and Davos to deliberate. Sansa's eyes, sharp and calculating as ever, narrowed as she laid out the intelligence reports. "Jon, they're testing us. If we hesitate, more will rise. These people respect strength, not mercy." Tyrion leaned forward, fingers steepled. "Strength, yes, but misused strength breeds rebellion. Jon, you've already shown mercy to many who expected punishment. You can't back down now without undermining everything you've built." Brienne, silent but imposing, simply nodded, her loyalty unquestioned, her presence a reminder that honor could also command respect. Jon listened, weighing their words carefully. He could feel the pull of instinct, the warrior's urge to crush rebellion before it spread, but he remembered the lessons of the North, of Ned Stark, and of the countless lives lost in wars driven by vengeance. "We will not start the reign of this crown with blood that can be avoided," Jon said finally, voice steady, carrying the authority of a king but tempered with restraint. I will ride to the Riverlands, not as a conqueror, but as their king. I will meet their leaders, hear their grievances, and offer them a chance to swear loyalty without fear of death. If they refuse, then they will face the consequences, but we will give them choice first. The room fell silent. Tyrion raised an eyebrow. That is bold, he said carefully. Sansa's expression remained skeptical, but Jon could see the flicker of respect. It was a dangerous gamble, but it was who he was. He had never been a king of cruelty, he had always been a king of justice. That had to be enough. Riding to the Riverlands was a journey marked by uneasy anticipation. Jon traveled with a small contingent of loyal soldiers, men and women who had fought beside him at the Wall, at Winterfell and beyond. Word of his approach spread quickly, carried on the wind like a whisper of hope, or a warning, depending on whom you asked. When he reached the gates of a small fortified town held by Frey loyalists, he found tension thick in the air. The gates opened slowly, revealing the nervous faces of men armed more with suspicion than with swords. Jon dismounted, the weight of the crown pressing on him in a way he hadn't anticipated. Here, away from the Red Keep, he was just Jon Snow, a man of the North, yet a man who carried the hopes of a kingdom. He looked at the lords and captains gathered before him. Some glared, some bowed half-heartedly, others whispered among themselves. I am Jon Snow, King of Westeros, he announced, voice carrying over the courtyard. I come not to punish, but to offer peace. Swear loyalty to the crown, and your lands, your families, and your honor will remain intact. Refuse, and we will deal with the matter as justice requires. For a moment, silence reigned. The men shifted uncomfortably, fear and uncertainty battling with pride and stubbornness. One of the older lords, a Frey scion with eyes cold as winter, stepped forward. And if we refuse, he asked, voice loud enough for all to hear. Jon met his gaze evenly. Then you will answer for it. But my sword is not the first recourse, my word is. I would rather win loyalty than force it. The Frey scion's jaw tightened, but no words came. The others looked at one another, some casting uneasy glances toward their leader. It took hours, conversations that stretched into the twilight, to sway the lords who had lingered in defiance. Jon spoke honestly, not as a king issuing threats, but as a man appealing to reason and shared responsibility. He reminded them of the wars that had torn Westeros apart, the blood spilled for ambition and revenge, and the chance they had now to create a different future. Slowly, the resistance began to crumble. One by one, lords swore loyalty, some grudgingly, others with genuine hope. By the time the stars dotted the sky, the Riverlands were, for the moment, unified under Jon Snow's rule, not out of fear, but out of trust, however fragile it might be. Returning to King's Landing, Jon sensed that the victory was only temporary. Whispers of dissatisfaction traveled faster than any army, and there were those in the city who had their own ambitions. Even in the council chambers, the shadows of betrayal were never far. Tyrion reminded him often that mercy and honor were not shields against cunning enemies. Sansa warned that every noble in Westeros had secrets, and some secrets could topple thrones. Jon absorbed the warnings without bitterness. They were facts of the world he had inherited. He had to navigate them with care, balancing compassion with vigilance. At night, in the quiet of his chambers, Jon reflected on the path he had chosen. Ruling with honor was harder than fighting the dead, harder than any battle he had faced. Every decision had consequences, and the weight of lives pressed down on him like the snow of the north. Yet, he felt something he had never felt before in power, a quiet pride. Not in conquest or fear, but in possibility. He could shape Westeros not through terror, but through integrity, fairness, and courage. Still, even as hope flickered, Jon knew the fire of the past still burned in secret. Loyalists of the old regime plotted in shadows, spies whispered lies in crowded halls, and the ghosts of betrayal never truly rested. But Jon Snow, who had faced death and darkness beyond the Wall, understood one truth: honor was not weakness. Fire, if wielded wisely, could protect as fiercely as it could destroy. And he was ready to wield both, not for vengeance, but for a kingdom reborn. The days that followed saw Jon establishing a system of justice unprecedented in Westeros. Minor lords who had long suffered under cruelty found their grievances heard. Taxes were restructured to ease burdens, not exploit them. The small folk, who had endured years of oppression, began to whisper hope, not fear. In the streets of King's Landing, where once crime and corruption had festered, a new order took root, fragile but alive. Jon's message was clear. Loyalty came from respect, not intimidation, and for the first time, many dared to believe it. But peace, as Jon knew all too well, was never simple in Westeros. Shadows of ambition, envy, and old hatred would not be easily quelled. The lords who had sworn allegiance today could turn against him tomorrow, yet Jon's resolve never wavered. He would face every threat with the same principle that had guided him through the long night: honor first, fire when necessary, and the courage to stand against the darkness, no matter where it came from. King's Landing had begun to breathe a cautious sigh of relief under Jon Snow's rule, but the city's pulse was still fraught with tension. The streets were cleaner, the markets more vibrant, and the people spoke of hope rather than fear, but behind the facades of normalcy, plots and schemes brewed. The nobles, even those who had sworn loyalty, were restless. They respected Jon's honor, yet some feared it, for his sense of justice disrupted the delicate games they had long played. Power in Westeros was never given freely. It was taken, traded, and occasionally stolen in the dead of night. Jon knew that maintaining order would require more than dragons and swords. It would demand vigilance, cunning, and patience. He had just returned from the Riverlands, still feeling the relief of victory, when a summons arrived from the Red Keep. A group of minor lords had requested an audience, claiming disputes over borders and taxes. Jon's instinct told him it could be a trap, but his conscience refused to ignore them. He reminded himself that leadership was not just about punishing rebels, but about guiding the realm toward fairness. As he entered the council chamber, he found the lords assembled, faces tight with anxiety or concealed resentment. Among them was a man named Lord Marbrand, whose eyes glinted with ambition, barely restrained by forced civility. Jon could feel the tension before it surfaced in words. "Your Grace," Lord Marbrand began, bowing with exaggerated politeness, "we come to appeal for clarity regarding recent decrees. Some of us fear unintended consequences," and Jon interrupted him gently yet firmly. "You fear, Lord Marbrand, because you do not trust the crown to be just. Speak plainly. I am not here to trick or punish you, but to listen and act wisely." The room stiffened. Many had expected threats, intimidation, or mockery, but Jon's calm demeanor unsettled them in a way words could not. Speaking honestly to a king who listened was dangerous for those accustomed to manipulation, yet strangely disarming. Hours passed as Jon debated with the lords, drawing out every concern, correcting miscommunications, and proposing solutions that balanced fairness with law. Some lords were skeptical, others grudgingly impressed, but all left with a clearer understanding of their responsibilities. It was slow, frustrating work, but Jon knew that a ruler who allowed grievances to fester only invited chaos. By the time he dismissed them, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the chamber in the glow of flickering torches. It was a small victory, perhaps unnoticed by the common folk, but in the world of nobles and power, small victories mattered more than the grand displays of might that Westeros had long admired. Yet even as Jon thought the day had been won, a whisper reached him through his network of trusted advisors. One of his spies reported a secret meeting between House Lannister and certain Frey loyalists, a pact formed in shadows to destabilize his rule. Jon felt a familiar chill, the one that had haunted him through the long night. He had fought armies and monsters, but cunning humans, filled with envy and greed, were often more dangerous. Jon knew that confronting such plots required care. Rash action could play into their hands, yet inaction could embolden them. He would have to act decisively, but with honor intact. That night Jon convened a private council with Tyrion, Sansa, and Davos. "We have whispers of betrayal," he said, spreading a map across the table. "Some of our new allies are planning in secret. If we expose them too soon, they vanish into the shadows. If we wait too long, they strike." Tyrion, ever pragmatic, suggested gathering evidence discreetly, leveraging spies, and using intelligence rather than brute force. Sansa advised caution, proposing a strategy to isolate the conspirators and secure loyalty among those wavering. Davos, loyal and straightforward, urged Jon not to let fear dictate his choices. "Remember what you said, Jon. Honor first. Don't let them bait you into losing what makes you strong." Jon nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settle like snow on his shoulders. Over the following days, Jon's spies moved quietly through the city, uncovering the full scope of the conspiracy. The Freys had promised support to a faction of Lannisters dissatisfied with Tyrion's influence, hoping to exploit the old wounds of Cersei's downfall. Jon studied the reports carefully, realizing that an outright confrontation could trigger civil unrest. He needed a solution that upheld justice while demonstrating the consequences of betrayal. In the dead of night, he convened the conspirators in the Great Hall under the pretense of negotiating loyalty. The room was filled with tension, the flickering torchlight casting long shadows across the walls. Jon entered alone, his presence commanding without arrogance. "You have met in secret," he said evenly, eyes scanning the room. "You have plotted against the crown, tell me why." The leaders exchanged uneasy glances, some stammered excuses, some remained silent, but Jon did not flinch. "I will not punish blindly, nor will I reward treachery," he continued. "But you must understand this, loyalty is not optional. Those who betray their oaths endanger not just themselves, but all they claim to protect. I offer a choice. Swear allegiance openly, and we rebuild trust. Refuse, and justice will decide your fate." Silence stretched. A palpable tension gripped the chamber. Then slowly, one by one, the lords knelt, swearing their loyalty to Jon Snow. Some did so reluctantly, others perhaps genuinely, but all recognized the authority of a king who wielded power tempered by honor. Jon felt no triumph, only relief. This was not victory in the traditional sense. It was the quiet, steady work of building a kingdom that could endure. He knew there would be more plots, more betrayals, but for now, Westeros had taken a small step toward stability. Even as Jon navigated political intrigue, he did not neglect the people. He walked through the streets of King's Landing, speaking with common folk, listening to their struggles, and ensuring that justice reached beyond the Red Keep. He saw children playing safely in courtyards, women trading goods freely, and men rebuilding homes destroyed by decades of conflict. It was a stark contrast to the fear-driven city he had entered months before. The people began to whisper his name not with caution, but with hope. Jon realized that ruling with honor was not just about nobles and battles, it was about changing the very soul of Westeros. Yet the shadows never truly disappeared. Jon felt eyes watching him, whispers following him, and hints of resentment simmering among those who had once wielded power through fear. He understood that his path was dangerous, and that the line between honor and vulnerability was razor-thin. But Jon had faced death beyond the wall, had stared into the abyss, and had seen the consequences of cowardice and betrayal. He would not falter. He would rule not with tyranny, nor with fear, but with fire and honor, and he would endure because the realm needed a king who could hold both. At the end of each day, Jon returned to the Red Keep, weary but resolute. The weight of the crown pressed heavily upon him. Yet he bore it with quiet dignity. The long night had taught him that fear could break men, but courage could save them. He was learning, day by day, how to balance justice, mercy, and strategy. And as he watched the flames of the hearth dance, he knew that the kingdom could survive, not through the threat of death, but through the strength of principle, the courage to act rightly, and the fire of hope that burned within him. Westeros was changing, slowly and painfully, but change had begun, and Jon Snow was determined to see it through, no matter the cost. The news came like a winter storm, sudden and harsh. A rebellion had broken out in the Reach, led by House Tarly's remnants and a few ambitious lords who had grown restless under Jon Snow's fair rule. They claimed his methods were weak, that mercy made him vulnerable, and that only fear could hold Westeros together. Jon received the reports in the quiet of his chambers, the candlelight flickering across his fur-lined cloak. His face was a mask of calm, but inside he felt the familiar weight of responsibility pressing down. This was the test he had always known would come, not a trial of swords against the dead, but of diplomacy, loyalty, and the strength of principle. He called his council immediately, gathering Sansa, Tyrion, Davos, and Brienne. Sansa's sharp gaze was full of concern as she spread the reports across the table. "They are claiming the people support them," she said. "If we don't act decisively, more lords will rise in defiance. They will test your patience, Jon. Every day we wait is another day they gather strength." Tyrion stroked his chin thoughtfully. "Decisive action doesn't always mean violence. he said. We need to remind them that rebellion carries consequences, but also that loyalty is rewarded. The Reach can't be allowed to spiral into chaos, yet it can't be crushed without alienating the people. Davos added quietly, and don't forget, Jon, even mercy has its limits. These men aren't asking for fairness, they're asking for weakness. You must be ready to defend what you've built. Jon listened carefully, weighing every word. He had always believed in fairness, in giving people the chance to do right, but he understood that fairness alone could not protect a kingdom. We ride to the Reach, he said finally, voice firm, but we ride not as conquerors nor as tyrants. We ride as a king who demands loyalty, who protects the people, and who punishes only when necessary. We will offer terms to those willing to swear allegiance, and those who refuse will face the consequences. Brienne nodded silently, ready as ever to follow Jon into danger, a reminder that courage could match honor. The journey south was long, stretching through forests and plains, the air thick with anticipation and unease. Jon traveled with a small host of loyal soldiers, each step echoing the lessons of the North: discipline, unity, and vigilance. Along the way, he stopped in villages, speaking to the people, listening to their fears and hopes. The common folk saw him not as a distant ruler, but as a protector. Mothers whispered blessings as he passed, children followed at a distance, and merchants offered him gifts of food and drink. Jon understood that ruling Westeros was not just about lords and armies, it was about earning the trust of those who had long been trampled by power. As they approached the rebellion's stronghold, Jon could feel the tension in the air. Scouts reported the presence of banners and armed men waiting to challenge his authority, yet Jon did not flinch. He dismounted at the edge of the enemy's encampment, walking forward alone, a symbol of courage and faith in his own principles. He was met by the rebellion's leaders, including a Tarly heir whose eyes burned with resentment and ambition. "King Snow," the man sneered, "you think mercy will save you here? You think honor will protect you? You will fail." Jon met his gaze steadily. "I will not fail because I do not seek power for myself. I seek justice, loyalty, and the survival of this realm. You have a choice: swear allegiance and serve the people, or face the consequences of rebellion. The decision is yours." For hours, negotiations unfolded in the shadow of tents and banners. Jon listened patiently as grievances were aired, correcting misinformation and offering compromises without compromising principle. Slowly, some lords began to waver, realizing that their rebellion was not just a gamble against a king, but a gamble against the people who had started to see Jon as a protector rather than a tyrant. When the Tarly heir refused to yield, Jon had no choice but to act decisively. He commanded a precise, limited strike, targeting only the leaders and their armed supporters while sparing villages and civilians. The dragons remained in the background, a looming threat rather than a weapon of slaughter. The rebellion was crushed with minimal bloodshed, but the message was clear: Westeros would not tolerate defiance, yet mercy would temper the crown's power. Returning to King's Landing after the campaign, Jon found the city restless but hopeful. News of his measured actions in the Reach spread quickly, both among nobles and the common folk. Some admired his fairness, others feared his quiet authority, and a few plotted still in shadowed halls. Jon did not pretend that the work was done. He knew that every victory was fragile, and that loyalty in Westeros was never guaranteed. But he also understood that ruling with honor, even when tested, had a power that fear alone could never achieve. The experience changed Jon in subtle ways. He had faced betrayal, ambition, and open defiance, yet he had held true to his principles. The weight of the crown was heavier than any sword he had carried, but it also carried a sense of purpose. He began to see the threads that bound Westeros together: loyalty, fear, respect, and hope, and realized that a king who balanced these threads wisely could weave a future stronger than any conquest could achieve. Even as he worked to stabilize the kingdom, Jon never forgot the people. He visited villages, met with leaders, and listened to complaints, not as a distant ruler, but as a man committed to justice. He restructured taxes to ease the burden on the poor, redistributed resources to towns devastated by war, and ensured that soldiers who had fought faithfully were rewarded. Word of his fairness traveled quickly, reaching even those who had once doubted him. The streets of King's Landing began to hum with a fragile, cautious optimism, a feeling many had not experienced in decades. Yet Jon's resolve was constantly tested. Whispers of conspiracy never ceased, and the crown could not simply rely on goodwill. He understood that even the most loyal allies could be tempted by ambition, and even the people could turn if they felt neglected or threatened. Each decision carried weight, each action had consequences, and Jon realized that ruling Westeros required more than courage. It required wisdom, patience, and the constant vigilance of one who truly understood the cost of honor. Night after night, Jon sat alone in the council chamber, reviewing reports, letters, and intelligence. He thought of the North, of the Wall of Winterfell, and of the countless lives lost to ambition and betrayal. He thought of the long night, when courage and honor had been the only shields against annihilation. Those memories shaped his decisions, reminding him that mercy and strength could coexist, but only if wielded with care. He had learned that power was not about dominating the world, but about protecting it, even when the weight of responsibility threatened to crush him. And so Jon Snow's rule continued, a delicate balance of honor and fire. Rebellion had tested him, but it had also proven his philosophy, that Westeros could be governed not by fear or cruelty, but by justice, courage, and the willingness to act rightly, even when the path was fraught with danger. The kingdom was far from secure, yet for the first time in generations, people whispered of hope, not doom. Jon knew that more challenges would come, more betrayals would surface, and more wars would threaten the fragile peace. But he also knew that he was no longer a boy from the north, no longer a man defined by loss and grief alone. He was a king who ruled with honor, and with fire to defend it, Westeros might finally find a chance to endure. King's Landing never truly slept. Even as Jon Snow thought the city might be settling into peace, he quickly realized that the greatest threats often came not from armies or dragons, but from whispers in dimly lit corridors and the subtle manipulations of those who claimed loyalty. The nobles who had once conspired in secret to challenge him had not entirely vanished. They were biding their time, watching for any sign of weakness, waiting to exploit a misstep. Jon had learned that in Westeros, the battlefield was not always a field of snow or blood-soaked plains. It could be a council chamber, a banquet hall, or even the quiet spaces where promises were made and broken. He began noticing small signs almost immediately. A messenger who stumbled over his words, letters that seemed slightly altered, suggestions from trusted advisors that contradicted previous plans. Nothing overt, nothing violent, but enough to raise Jon's suspicion. He summoned Tyrion first, the man whose mind was as sharp as Valyrian steel. Tyrion examined the letters, spoke to messengers, and traced patterns. "There is a network forming," he said gravely. "Not open rebellion yet, but influence, manipulation, whispers in the ears of the right or wrong people. You must be careful, Jon. The city's shadows are long, and the enemies in them are clever." Sansa, always perceptive, warned that nobles would test his patience, sending spies disguised as servants or advisors. Even Brienne, quiet but unwavering, noted that a king who showed too much leniency could be seen as weak. Jon absorbed their counsel, knowing that vigilance and honor would need to walk hand in hand. The first overt sign came during a council meeting. A minor lord, recently sworn to loyalty, questioned Jon's decision to redistribute grain to villages in the outskirts rather than funnel it to the capital. His tone was polite, but his words carried accusation, implying that Jon's rule favored the common folk over noble privilege. Jon considered the man carefully, seeing fear behind the arrogance. "I serve the realm, not just its rulers," Jon replied calmly. "A kingdom cannot survive if its people starve, no matter the size of a lord's coffers. Loyalty is earned, not demanded by fear or wealth alone." The lord's jaw tightened, but he said nothing further. Jon realized that principle alone was sometimes a sword and sometimes a shield, but it could also make enemies who were subtle, patient, and cunning. In the days that followed, Jon's advisors uncovered more threads of intrigue. Certain council members had begun leaking information to ambitious lords in distant regions, attempting to undermine his authority through rumors and exaggerations. Jon did not act in anger. He could not afford to. He spent hours studying the network, identifying those who could be trusted and those whose loyalty was questionable. He then summoned them individually, speaking with honesty and firmness, offering both warning and guidance. "I am not a king who rules by terror," he told them, "but I am a king who protects the realm and its people. Betray that, and there will be consequences. Choose loyalty, and you will be rewarded. The choice is yours. Even as Jon navigated political intrigue, he maintained his connection to the people. He walked the streets of King's Landing in disguise at times, listening to rumors, hearing complaints, and observing how the city functioned without his immediate presence. He saw children playing in courtyards, men repairing roofs, women tending gardens. But he also saw the subtle fear in servants' eyes when certain nobles passed, the careful avoidance of certain neighborhoods where whispers of betrayal had begun to spread. Jon understood that the heart of a kingdom was not just in its walls or banners, it was in the trust between the ruler and the ruled. To protect that trust, he would need both wisdom and courage. One night a plot reached its peak. A poisoned cup intended for Jon during a council dinner was discovered by Sir Davos, who had grown increasingly vigilant. The wine had been laced with a slow-acting toxin designed to make Jon appear weak over time rather than kill him outright. Davos confronted Jon quietly, holding the vial. "The shadows have teeth," he said grimly. Jon examined it, his jaw tightening. He had suspected this moment, yet it stung to know that the threat had been so close. He called Tyrion and Sansa immediately. "We must confront this, but not with blood alone," he said. "Justice, intelligence, and the promise of fairness will be our weapons. We must uncover the culprits and make them accountable without losing the moral ground we've fought to establish." Over the next days, Jon orchestrated a careful investigation. Servants, advisors, and nobles were questioned, watched, and analyzed. It became clear that a faction within the council, feeling threatened by Jon's redistribution of power and his favor toward the common folk, had attempted to strike at him. Jon could have executed them immediately, sending a clear message of fear, but he refused. Instead, he stripped the conspirators of power, reassigned their responsibilities to loyal and competent men and women, and held a public council where the facts were revealed. He gave them the chance to swear true loyalty or face permanent exile. Some acquiesced, others were sent to distant regions to serve in ways that removed their influence in the capital. The message was clear. The crown would act decisively, but with fairness, and the people would see that justice was not blind cruelty. Through it all, Jon felt the heavy weight of ruling a city steeped in ambition, corruption, and old grudges. He walked alone in the Red Keep's courtyards at night, thinking of Winterfell, of the Wall, and of the long night. He remembered the soldiers he had lost, the friends he had buried, and the countless lives sacrificed to ambition and cruelty. He understood that leadership in Westeros was a constant balance between strength and mercy, vigilance and compassion. Every choice could ripple across the kingdom, every mistake could be fatal. And yet, he held firm to his principles, knowing that the survival of Westeros depended not on fear or tyranny, but on honor tempered with fire. Slowly, Jon began to see results. The conspirators learned that plots would fail if justice and wisdom guided action. Nobles realized that the king would not bend to fear or deception. Even those who had once doubted him began to speak of his fairness, his courage, and his integrity. The people of King's Landing began to whisper his name not only with hope, but with reverence. Children ran freely, merchants prospered, and soldiers who had fought for the realm were honored openly. Jon felt a rare satisfaction, though he knew it was fragile. Westeros had long memories, and even a king of honor could be undone by ambition and betrayal. In the quiet of his chambers, Jon reflected on the trials of the past weeks. The poisoned cup, the secret meetings, the whispers of rebellion. It was a reminder that power alone did not define a king. Character, courage, and a commitment to justice were what allowed a ruler to endure. He had faced death beyond the wall, armies of the dead, and the bitter betrayals of men, but ruling Westeros required a different kind of strength. It required patience, wisdom, and the constant vigilance of a heart anchored in principle. Jon Snow understood that now more than ever. And so the city slept under the watchful eyes of a king who ruled not with fear, but with honor and fire. Westeros had not yet seen the last of ambition, deceit, or rebellion, but for the first time in generations, there was a ruler who could face it with courage, fairness, and unwavering integrity. Jon knew that the path ahead would be dangerous, filled with shadows and whispers, yet he also knew that he was no longer a boy, no longer a man defined by loss alone. He was a king who would endure, and in doing so, he would shape a kingdom that might finally survive beyond the cycle of betrayal and bloodshed. Even as King's Landing began to stabilize under Jon Snow's measured and principled rule, the wider realm of Westeros was restless. Word reached him from the north that the lands beyond the Neck were simmering with tension. While Sansa ruled Winterfell wisely in his stead during his absence, some northern lords questioned the authority of a king who had spent so much time in the south. They whispered that Jon, the hero of the Long Night, might have forgotten the North's ways, that honor tempered with mercy was a dangerous weakness among men who prized strength and vengeance. Jon understood their perspective. The North had survived by fire and steel, not politeness. Yet he refused to abandon his ideals, knowing that the lessons of the Long Night applied to all of Westeros, not just the frozen lands of his youth. Reports also came from the Vale, where a coalition of lords threatened to exploit Jon's absence, claiming that a Northman king could not fairly adjudicate disputes among them. Across the seas, emissaries from Dorne and the Stormlands arrived, their words veiled in diplomacy, but their eyes sharp with calculation. Even the Iron Islands, ever restless and unpredictable, tested his patience, sending fleets along the coast under the pretext of trade while preparing for raids that might destabilize the southern shores. Jon recognized that ruling Westeros was not about simple battles. It was a constant chess game where every move could trigger war or peace. He spent weeks in council with Tyrion, Sansa, and Davos, strategizing ways to secure the kingdom without sacrificing the principles that defined him. "We cannot simply crush them with force," Tyrion reminded him. "Strength is necessary, yes, but it must be measured. They are watching. Every act of cruelty or impatience will fuel rebellion elsewhere." Sansa nodded, suggesting subtle alliances, marriage pacts, and gifts of support to lords willing to swear loyalty. "The North will follow you, Jon," she said quietly, "but the South is not the North. You must show them the strength of your mind as well as your sword." Davos, ever the voice of reason, reminded Jon that even well-intentioned rulers could be undone by secrecy and deception. "The key," he said, "is to protect the people first, even if the lords complain. Let them plot. You will act when necessary." Jon began sending emissaries to the restless regions, but he also prepared personally for any threat that might come to Westeros' borders. He rode south with a small contingent, testing his forces, reviewing the loyalty of his generals, and meeting with local lords to hear their concerns firsthand. Each encounter reminded him that leadership required presence, not just proclamations from the Red Keep. People respected a king who listened, who acted fairly, but they feared a king who was absent, even one with dragons at his command. In the north, tension reached a peak when a group of northern lords challenged Sansa's authority, questioning whether Jon's principles were strong enough to protect the realm from internal threats. Jon rode north swiftly, accompanied by loyal northern soldiers and a small council of trusted advisors. When he arrived, he did not march with banners of war, but entered Winterfell under the banner of diplomacy and reason. Lords gathered in the Great Hall, their expressions skeptical, their hands twitching near swords hidden beneath cloaks. Jon stood tall, his fur cloak heavy against the chill of the hall, his eyes steady as he addressed them. "I fought alongside you during the Long Night," he said, voice ringing through the chamber. "We faced death together. I have always honored the North and its people, but loyalty is not optional. The kingdom is fragile, and every act of defiance threatens the lives of those we swore to protect. I do not demand fear, I demand unity. Swear your allegiance, or leave Winterfell to those who will uphold it." Some lords, hardened by years of independence, resisted. They demanded concessions, rights, and privileges they believed were their birthright. Jon listened patiently, negotiating where possible, refusing only when compromise would undermine justice or the safety of the realm. When a small faction continued to plot against him, he moved decisively, sending them to serve in distant regions where their influence could no longer destabilize Winterfell. The rest swore their loyalty openly, though the tension lingered in the hall long after the meeting ended. Jon knew that patience was a weapon, but that sometimes action must follow words. While Jon managed the north, he also turned his attention to the south. The Vale's coalition of lords had begun testing the edges of his authority, and he realized that delay could embolden them. He sent envoys offering reconciliation, trade agreements, and assurances of justice, but he kept a small force ready to intervene should diplomacy fail. In Dawn and the Stormlands, emissaries reported whispers of discontent and secret alliances, yet Jon remained calm. He knew that patience, observation, and calculated action were more powerful than immediate force. His dragons, while terrifying in battle, were symbols of deterrence rather than tools of fear. Even with these external pressures, Jon remained committed to the people. Villages that had suffered during past conflicts received aid, resources were distributed fairly, and Jon personally oversaw the reinforcement of defenses in strategic areas. He held public courts in cities across Westeros, listening to disputes and ruling with fairness. The people began to see a king who did not just rule over them, but fought for their survival and prosperity. For many, Jon Snow became a symbol of hope in a land long ruled by fear. Yet despite these successes, Jon could feel the weight of exhaustion settling over him. Each day brought reports of unrest, plots, and small rebellions. Each night, he wrestled with decisions that could change lives forever. Even with dragons and loyal soldiers, he understood that the realm was fragile and that his reign would be tested by both ambition and circumstance. Still, Jon remained resolute. He had faced the dead and survived, and he had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the strength to act rightly despite it. In a quiet moment, Jon rode out to the cliffs overlooking the sea near Dragonstone. The wind whipped around him, cold and biting, and the waves crashed against the rocks below. He thought of the enemies he had faced, the friends he had lost, and the countless lives depending on him. He understood that his principles, honor, justice, mercy tempered with vigilance, were both his greatest strengths and his heaviest burdens. But he also knew that Westeros had never needed a king like him more than it did now. The storms of rebellion, ambition, and deceit would come, but he would meet them with the same courage that had carried him through the long night. As night fell over Dragonstone, Jon Snow looked to the horizon. The seas were dark, but the stars above burned bright, guiding him in the same way his conscience and honor guided his decisions. The realm was far from safe, but he was not a king who shied from danger. Westeros would be tested, enemies would rise, and old grudges would seek vengeance. But Jon Snow had something they did not, the fire of dragons and the fire of integrity, both burning within him. And for the first time in generations, Westeros had a chance to endure not through fear or tyranny, but through courage, justice, and honor. Jon Snow returned to King's Landing with a heavy heart, knowing that the true test of his rule was not only in distant lands, but in the city itself. Even with his dragons, loyal advisors, and hard-won victories in the north and the Reach, the Red Keep was a place of constant intrigue. The courtiers, nobles, and council members all whispered behind closed doors, plotting, maneuvering, and testing the boundaries of the king's patience and mercy. Jon understood that power in Westeros was never simply given. It was seized, betrayed, and sometimes stolen in the dead of night. He would need to act with both caution and courage, balancing his honor with the fire he had at his command. The first sign of trouble came during a council meeting. Jon noticed subtle exchanges between certain council members, glances that carried veiled meanings, and words that seemed innocent but were loaded with suggestion. Tyrion noticed it as well, his sharp eyes catching the patterns Jon might have missed. "Your Grace," Tyrion said quietly as the meeting adjourned, "there are factions forming. Some believe that your mercy makes you weak. They are testing you, seeing how far they can push before you respond." Jon listened, feeling the weight of responsibility settle like a stone in his chest. He knew that impatience could play into their hands, yet indecision could allow these factions to grow stronger. It was a delicate balance, and one that required all of his cunning, wisdom, and restraint. Soon, Jon discovered that the conspirators' plans extended far beyond whispered words. There were attempts to manipulate his decisions through false reports, to sway his generals with promises of gold and influence, and even to poison his allies. Jon confronted each situation carefully, investigating quietly and gathering evidence before acting. When the culprits were identified, he did not lash out with rash vengeance. Instead, he stripped them of power, publicly revealed their plots, and offered them a choice: swear true loyalty and serve justly, or face permanent exile and the loss of their lands and titles. Some submitted reluctantly, others were removed entirely, and the rest learned that plotting against a king who ruled with honor came with severe consequences. Even as he dealt with betrayal within his own council, Jon could not ignore the wider implications. The nobles of Westeros were watching, waiting to see whether the king would bend to fear, cruelty, or ambition. Jon knew that his reputation would be determined not only by the dragons he commanded or the battles he won, but by the integrity with which he ruled. He held counsel with his advisors frequently, weighing each decision carefully, considering its effects not only on those immediately involved, but on the realm as a whole. He understood that a king who ruled through fear might command obedience, but a king who ruled with justice and honor could earn loyalty that endured for generations. Tensions escalated further when a faction of Lannisters, still bitter over Tyrion's influence and Jon's fair redistribution of resources, attempted to manipulate key generals in the army. Jon acted decisively, calling the generals together and speaking plainly. "I know there are whispers," he said, his voice calm but commanding. "Some seek to turn you against me, to make you question loyalty and honor. I will not demand blind obedience, but I will demand honesty. Any who betray the realm or their oaths will face justice. Those who remain loyal will be rewarded, not just with gold or titles, but with trust and responsibility." The generals, many hardened by war and experience, nodded, understanding that Jon's clarity and integrity were not weaknesses, but shields against manipulation. While navigating these political storms, Jon never lost sight of the people. He spent time walking the streets, speaking with citizens, listening to grievances, and ensuring that justice reached beyond the walls of the Red Keep. Villagers and merchants who had once feared the crown now spoke with hope, acknowledging that Jon's rule was different. Soldiers and officers who had fought alongside him in battle were honored and rewarded, reinforcing loyalty not through fear, but through recognition of service. Jon understood that his authority depended on both respect and trust, and he worked tirelessly to strengthen both. Yet even with vigilance, the conspirators grew bolder. They attempted to sow discord between Jon and Sansa, spreading lies about northern loyalty and accusing her of secretly undermining his decisions. Jon confronted these rumors directly, summoning both Sansa and the accusers to the council chamber. He spoke with a clarity and calmness that left no room for deception. "Sansa has proven her loyalty and wisdom time and again," Jon said, eyes scanning the room. "Any who attempt to spread lies or manipulate the crown will face consequences. This kingdom does not thrive on distrust or deception. It thrives on honesty, loyalty, and the courage to act rightly." The room fell silent, and the weight of Jon's words left the conspirators cautious and uncertain. Despite his careful measures, Jon knew that power in King's Landing was never absolute. Each day brought new challenges, new schemes, and new threats, but he remained steadfast. He trained with his dragons, not only as instruments of war, but as symbols of deterrence. He reviewed reports from spies and messengers, mapping the movements and intentions of nobles, generals, and outsiders alike. He held courts, mediated disputes, and ensured that justice reached even the most overlooked citizens. Each action reinforced his principles, demonstrating that a king could be both strong and honorable, merciful yet decisive. Jon's leadership was tested most profoundly when a plot to assassinate him was uncovered within the Red Keep itself. One of his trusted advisors, tempted by promises of power from a faction of southern lords, had conspired to poison his food and frame another loyal council member. Jon uncovered the scheme through careful observation and questioning, confronting the traitor directly. "I rule not through fear, but through honor," he said quietly, looking the man in the eyes. "You have betrayed that trust, and you will answer for it. But I will not kill you outright. You will be sent to serve in distant lands, stripped of influence and authority. Let your exile be a reminder that betrayal carries consequences, but loyalty is rewarded." The advisor, trembling, understood that Jon's justice was measured yet absolute, and that integrity was not negotiable. By the end of these trials, Jon Snow had cemented his rule in King's Landing not through terror, but through a combination of honor, vigilance, and decisive action. The conspirators who remained learned to respect him, the generals understood his expectations, and the people began to see a king who could be trusted. Westeros, still fragile and scarred by centuries of war, was beginning to feel the steady hand of a ruler who balanced fire and mercy, strength and principle. Jon knew that challenges would continue to arise, that ambition and betrayal were never truly gone. Yet he also knew that he had proven the strength of his vision, that honor, when wielded wisely, could survive even in the most treacherous courts. As Jon stood on the balcony of the Red Keep one evening, looking over the city, he reflected on the weeks of intrigue and danger. The lights of the streets glimmered in the dusk, and the quiet hum of the city reminded him that even in a place of constant plotting, life went on. He had faced betrayal, conspiracy, and the subtle weapons of ambition, yet he remained unbroken. His dragons rested nearby, their quiet presence a reminder of the power that lay at his command. Yet Jon knew that true power was not in fire or steel. It was in the integrity of his decisions, the courage to act rightly, and the trust of those who lived under his rule. In that moment, Jon Snow understood that ruling Westeros required constant vigilance, wisdom, and an unshakable commitment to principle. The shadows of betrayal would never vanish entirely, but he had proven that they could be navigated, managed, and overcome. Westeros could survive, even flourish, if guided by a king who refused to compromise his honor, even when the fires of ambition and deceit burned around him. Jon's rule was not yet complete, and the challenges ahead were as daunting as ever, but for the first time, the kingdom glimpsed the possibility of a future shaped not by fear, but by courage, justice, and the enduring strength of a king who had faced death, darkness, and betrayal, and had emerged unbowed. Despite weeks of careful consolidation, Jon Snow sensed a storm gathering that even his dragons and loyal generals might struggle to weather. Reports reached him from all corners of Westeros, rumors of a massive force amassing beyond the narrow sea, led by mercenaries and exiles eager to reclaim lost influence. Northern lords, though outwardly loyal, murmuring discontent over Jon's focus on the south, and whispers from King's Landing itself, where ambitious nobles still plotted in shadows, seeking to test the king's resolve once more. Jon understood that the kingdom could not be ruled with merely courage or dragons alone. He needed foresight, strategy, and the unshakable adherence to the principles that had earned him respect across the realm. He convened his council at the Red Keep, this time calling not only Tyrion, Sansa, and Davos, but Brienne and a select group of loyal generals who had proven themselves in battle and diplomacy alike. "We face threats that are both within and beyond our walls," Jon said quietly, laying a map on the table. "The enemies are not always obvious. Some wear crowns and speak with courtesy, others come in armies from afar. All must be addressed with clarity, honor, and fire when necessary." Tyrion, ever pragmatic, pointed out that while diplomacy could stabilize the majority of Westeros, decisive action would be required to prevent external invaders from gaining a foothold. Sansa reminded Jon that the loyalty of northern lords, while strong, could waver if they perceived the south as favored. Brienne, silent but steadfast, simply nodded, ready to enforce Jon's will wherever it was needed. Jon decided to split his attention carefully. While Sansa and Davos oversaw northern stability, he would travel south to inspect coastal defenses and meet with potential allies among the Vale, Dawn, and the Stormlands. The dragons, ever loyal, flew overhead as a deterrent, their presence a silent promise that Westeros would not fall to brute force alone. Along the journey, Jon observed villages and towns, speaking with citizens and soldiers alike, ensuring that fear did not creep back into the hearts of the people. He found that the same approach that had earned him respect in King's Landing, listening, fairness, and decisive action when necessary, worked just as well across the realm, reinforcing the perception of a king who could balance compassion and strength. South, Jon met with lords who had long been skeptical of northern leadership. They questioned his understanding of their customs, the nuances of their politics, and his ability to protect them against both internal and external threats. Jon met each concern openly, offering assurances not through gold or coercion, but through logic, foresight, and demonstration of his commitment to justice. He promised protection for their people, fair resolution of disputes, and recognition of loyalty. Many were skeptical at first, but his sincerity and the quiet menace of the dragons convinced most to pledge allegiance, at least temporarily. Jon understood, however, that pledges could be fragile. The true test would come when the external threat finally arrived. As Jon returned to King's Landing, intelligence from spies brought alarming news. A coalition of exiled lords and mercenary commanders had begun coordinating attacks on multiple fronts. Some would strike along the coasts, others sought to rally rebellious factions within the city itself. Jon realized that the final test of his reign would require not only dragons and armies, but cunning, alliances, and a willingness to confront betrayal in its most insidious forms. He began preparing for simultaneous campaigns, sending trusted generals to secure key coastal fortresses while he reinforced the city's defenses and personally oversaw the training of loyal soldiers. Every decision was calculated, every move deliberate, for the margin of error was perilously small. Meanwhile, within the Red Keep, the Whisper network of ambitious nobles had grown bolder. Certain council members attempted to exploit the external threat, suggesting compromises or questioning Jon's strategy, hoping to manipulate him into mistakes. Jon, however, had grown wiser to such tactics. He convened meetings where evidence, logic, and principles guided discussion, leaving little room for deception. "We cannot act on fear or manipulation," Jon told them firmly. "We act based on knowledge, loyalty, and justice. Those who undermine our mission risk not only their standing, but the safety of all Westeros." Some council members, recognizing the resolve in his voice and the dragon's presence beyond the windows, grew cautious. Others, still ambitious, retreated to plot in shadows. Jon expected as much. Westeros had never been free of schemers, but he refused to let cunning or greed derail his vision. As the threat grew clearer, Jon realized that timing would be everything. The exiled coalition could not be allowed to coordinate indefinitely. He sent envoys to negotiate temporary truces among certain factions, while simultaneously moving loyal forces to strategic positions. He trained with the dragons, testing their response to complex maneuvers, ensuring they could act as both deterrent and weapon if war erupted. Nights were spent studying maps, calculating supply lines, and considering every possible betrayal or misstep that could jeopardize the kingdom. Jon Snow understood that leadership required constant vigilance, a clear mind, and an unwavering moral compass. One wrong decision could undo decades of progress, and he could not allow that to happen. Despite the looming danger, Jon did not neglect the people. He visited districts of King's Landing, walking among citizens and soldiers, listening to complaints, and ensuring that order and justice were maintained. Even as spies reported plots and armies massed beyond the horizon, Jon remained visible, approachable, and steadfast. The people, inspired by his presence and leadership, began to rally, understanding that their king would defend them not with tyranny, but with integrity and courage. Soldiers trained harder, merchants grew more confident, and whispers of hope replaced murmurs of fear. Jon realized that the heart of Westeros could be strengthened as much by trust and honor as by dragons and swords. Yet for all his preparation, Jon felt the weight of isolation pressing down. Decisions that affected thousands were his alone to bear. Nights were restless, haunted by memories of past battles, lost friends, and the countless lives at stake. The burden of leadership in Westeros was heavier than any sword he had wielded. Still, he drew strength from the lessons of the long night. Courage was not the absence of fear, and honor was the shield that could protect both a king and his people. He understood that the trials ahead would test every ounce of his wisdom, strategy, and resolve. As Jon gazed out from the Red Keep balcony one night, the city stretched beneath him, a mosaic of light, shadow, and whispered plots. Dragons circled overhead, their wings cutting through the dark sky. The exiled coalition's movements had accelerated, and spies reported that factions within the city were poised to act when the moment was right. Jon knew the coming days would require him to act decisively, blending diplomacy, strategy, and the fire of his dragons in ways Westeros had never seen before. Failure was not an option, not for him, not for the people who had begun to trust him, and not for the fragile hope that Westeros might finally endure beyond cycles of betrayal and war. Jon Snow had survived the dead, the long night, and the bitter betrayals of men. He had faced rebellion, assassination attempts, and the relentless machinations of nobles in King's Landing. Yet the greatest test of his reign was still to come, a coordinated threat that combined internal treachery and external invasion, forcing him to wield his dragons, his sword, and his honor with precision. Westeros was at a tipping point, and Jon understood that only a king who balanced courage, justice, and foresight could tip it toward survival. The fires of war and intrigue were rising, and Jon Snow, the king who ruled with honor and fire, would have to stand at the center of the storm. The day the threat arrived, Westeros held its breath. From the narrow sea came a fleet of exiles, mercenaries, and ambitious lords who had refused to bend to Jon Snow's authority. Within King's Landing, conspirators who had waited for weakness to appear were now revealed, acting openly to destabilize the city at the same moment the external army landed. Jon stood on the Red Keep balcony, dragons coiling above him, the wind whipping through his dark hair, and felt the full weight of the kingdom pressing on his shoulders. This was the moment he had been preparing for. Years of struggle, loss, and wisdom converged into a single, defining hour. Jon moved quickly, not with panic, but with calculated resolve. He sent loyal generals to defend key gates, commanded the citizens to assist in fortifications, and rode among his soldiers, bolstering courage with presence. His dragons took to the sky, not merely as weapons of destruction, but as symbols of the power of a ruler who would defend his people at all costs. Fire met steel as the invaders breached the walls, and Jon led charges with the sword of his ancestors, demonstrating that courage in action inspired more loyalty than any decree could. Sansa coordinated reinforcements from the north, Davos rallied the city militia, and Brienne fought at Jon's side, cutting down those who sought to exploit chaos for ambition. Inside the city, conspirators who had once whispered in shadows found themselves exposed. Jon confronted them personally, reminding them of his principles even as he enforced justice. Those who submitted were stripped of power, those who resisted were removed decisively, and every action sent a clear message. Westeros would not survive on fear alone, but betrayal and cowardice would not go unpunished. The people, seeing their king act with both courage and fairness, rallied with renewed vigor, and the city became a force equal to the external invaders. The battle raged for hours. Dragons roared across the skyline, soldiers clashed in the streets, and Jon moved with a blend of strategy and instinct, honoring his commitment to minimize civilian casualties. Every decision was precise, every action balanced between fire and mercy. When the exiled lords, leaders fell either to Jon himself or to his loyal forces, the remaining invaders faltered, their morale shattered by the unity of a city that had once seemed weak but now stood unbreakable. Westeros had been tested, and Jon Snow had proven that leadership founded on honor, courage, and strategic wisdom could withstand the fiercest storms. When the dust settled, King's Landing was scarred but intact. The city's people, though exhausted, celebrated not just survival, but the demonstration of a king who had earned their trust. The conspirators who had survived were sent into exile or placed under strict supervision, their ambitions carefully curtailed. Jon knew the victory was not just military, it was moral. Westeros had witnessed a ruler who wielded power not as a tyrant, but as a protector, whose strength was inseparable from his integrity. The whispers of fear that had once plagued the halls of the Red Keep were replaced by a cautious respect, and even the most skeptical nobles began to understand that Jon Snow's reign was different from any they had known. In the aftermath, Jon walked through the city, seeing the cost of war, yet also the signs of resilience. Children returned to streets once filled with fear, merchants reopened shops, and soldiers who had fought bravely were honored. Jon understood that a king's work was never finished. Westeros would always require vigilance, but he felt a rare sense of satisfaction. The trials he had endured, from the long night to betrayal within his council, had forged him into a ruler capable of balancing fire, honor, and justice. For the first time, the realm had a chance to endure beyond the cycles of violence and ambition that had long defined it. In the quiet that followed, Jon returned to the Red Keep balcony, dragons resting nearby, and gazed out over the city and the lands beyond. The winds carried the distant sound of rebuilding, and the sky was tinged with the first light of dawn. He thought of the north, of Winterfell, of the long winters and the battles that had shaped him, and he realized that Westeros had changed, not because he had wielded power recklessly, but because he had ruled with courage, foresight, and unwavering principle. The kingdom was far from perfect, the threats never-ending, but the foundation he had laid was strong. Jon Snow understood that the story of his reign would be remembered not just for battles or dragons, but for the rare combination of mercy and decisiveness, honor and fire. Westeros had survived its greatest test not through fear, but through a king who embodied the ideals he had always believed in: courage, loyalty, and the willingness to stand firm even when the world sought to sway him. And as the sun rose over the city, casting golden light across the towers and streets, Jon knew that while challenges would always come, Westeros had a leader ready to face them, not as a tyrant, but as a king who ruled with heart, mind, and fire. Jon Snow had proven that honor could survive in Westeros, that dragons were more than tools of destruction, and that a kingdom could endure if led by a ruler who balanced strength with wisdom, justice with mercy, and courage with vision. Westeros, scarred yet resilient, would face future storms, but it would do so under a king who had fought the dead, the ambitious, and the treacherous, and emerged not only alive but victorious, a symbol of hope for generations to come.